From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. The decline of an American icon, IBM, and how to fix it before it's too late. Former IBMer gives us the inside story tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Peter Greulich spent 30 years as an IBMer, going from sales to systems engineer to brand manager to worldwide market manager. He's spoken with thousands of IBMers across the globe. In his new book, Think Again, IBM Can Maximize Shareholder Value. He was on our show previously for his book on IBM, A View from Beneath the Dancing Elephant, Rediscovering IBM's Corporate Constitution. Welcome back, Pete. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. It's great to be back. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, but before you start off, tell folks, basically, that you're a loyal IBMer, what it means to you, that you're not some sort of bitter ex-employee kind of deal.
Oh, absolutely. I spent 30 years at IBM, and it was the greatest experience of my life. I remember standing in line one time, getting ready to fly to one of the sales education seminars that I used to conduct for IBMers around the world. And this young man was standing behind me, and he saw my bag, and it had labeled IBM on it. And he asked me, how long you worked for IBM? I said, 25 years. And he looked at me and goes, oh, my God, how could anybody work for one company for 25 years? And I looked at him, and I said, you don't understand. I've changed jobs every 3 years. The company believes that if you do your job, the next job is just to be had for the asking. And I said, I've had 8 jobs in 25 years, and I've changed my job and my career, and I couldn't imagine doing that with any other company. And he just looked at me and went, wow, that's a real selling point. And I gave him my card and said, give me a call. I'd like for you to work for IBM someday. So no bitterness. It's just a desire to see IBM to get its greatness back. And in order to do that, it needs to kind of get its institutional memory back, and that is understanding that the productivity of the corporation is really dependent upon whether their employees are engaged, enthusiastic, and passionate about their work. And hopefully that comes across in what I just told you. Yeah, it does, definitely. And this issue that you raise on a one company level, we've now seen it in 3 different ways on our show. This is the third way. This focus on maximizing shareholder stock price only ends up to the detriment of the overall corporation. We had a guy on who basically says Harvard Business School pushed this metric in the mid-'80s, and the net result at the end of it was the financial crash. We have the CEO of Young and Rubicam, and he believes that a lot of the stagnating income and income inequality has come from moving away from stakeholder maximization to just stock price. So what I want to ask you first off is, for whose benefit should a corporation be run? Well, man, that is a great question, Jim. Here's the deal. I entered the study of IBM 6 years ago and didn't have an opinion. I just kind of decided to do the research and let it, kind of unveil itself as I went through studying 100 years of its history. And when you look at IBM's successes and failures, that its greatest successes have been built upon a business-first philosophy, and that business-first philosophy is built around an equitable distribution of profits to IBM's what I call stakeholders. And stakeholders, I define and write about in my book, are its customers first, its employees, its shareholders, and then its obligation to, be a good corporate citizen within society. So, the title of my book, IBM Can Maximize Shareholder Value, is a very positive title, and I intended it that way because I think it's not maximizing shareholder value that's truly wrong. I think we ought to be trying to maximize stakeholder value, which would maximize shareholder value. But the how that IBM has been going after it, and there's 3 instances in IBM history that it's gone after it in the wrong way, has always led to failure.
And it's
interesting. Does that make sense, Jim?
It's a very profound point that in order to maximize shareholder value, they have to stop maximizing shareholder value, meaning And they've done a lot of financial engineering. You talk about they bought $166 billion of stock back, and you think that underinvests essentially in stakeholders.
Oh, well, absolutely. And in fact, there's two numbers you'll hear me use, and I don't want anybody to get truly too confused. You'll hear me talk about $190 billion since 1995, $166 billion since 1999. So I like to use the $190 billion because a lot of people tend to think that, this started with Sam Palmisano when he took over in 2002. Mm-hmm. But actually, IBM started buying back its stock in 1995, and since then has bought back $190 billion worth of stock. And that started in 1995, which is just 1 year after it laid off some 30 to 40,000 employees. And that's a symptom. One of the things I like to talk about is, where else could they have invested that money? And if you look at the timeline for artificial intelligence, in 1995, IBM started their share buybacks, spending about $5 billion. In 1996, Deep Blue won its first chess match, and by that time they'd spent about $11 billion on stock. In 1997, Deep Blue wins its first six-game match, and by then they'd spent $18 billion. And then artificial intelligence just went quiet until 2011. And then suddenly it comes back to compete with Jeopardy, and they've spent $150 billion on their stock. They could have spent that somewhere else. That
is pretty found. You also make these points that their sales force productivity is down 46% per employee, and net income's down 10%. And obviously productivity is what drives growth. But another thing that blows me away, and it's been covered up in a way because of the focus on the roadmap on price per share, right? You buy stock back, you reduce the denominator, and you can make it look like you're growing. But in 2012, IBM had $17 billion of profits. In 2016, they had $12 billion. In other words, their actual dollar profits are down 30%.
Right. Yeah, and you'll see, Jim, as you probably read in my book, is that I focus on productivity because, as you said, it ultimately what drove America in the 20th century and gave us such wealth as a society was the ongoing improvement of employee productivity. And when I looked at the profit productivity numbers, it's actually down 10% overall in the 21st century. And I think something that's really telling is that, just as you pointed out, not only is profit down, and in fact, that's the quarter-to-quarter kind of Wall Street thing today, right? 21 quarters of declining revenue. Well, boy, that's really bad. But when you start talking about 17 years of declining profit productivity and revenue productivity, there's a systemic problem at IBM that needs to be fixed.
Let's look at some of in our last couple of minutes here, some of the culture crisis drivers that have changed the nature. And first off, this day in 1999 when they changed the from defined benefits, you call it almost, or at least I interpret it almost as the day IBM died.
Yeah, I call it a watershed event. And Lou Gerstner in his book, Who Says Elephants Can't Dance, says that this affected a small number of people and there was a small revolution. But in reality, it affected over 50% of the IBM population at the time. Most of us were here in the U.S., and not only did the U.S. drive, but it was where the product managers were located, the development organizations. And when he made that decision in July of 1999, I think every employee suddenly, realized that when he said it's not your father's IBM, it meant something completely different to him than it did to all the employees. And, it was a watershed event for every employee employees in the U.S. And then that policy has continued. It's been rolled overseas with Sam Palmisano. They took away the defined benefit plan from the U.K. employees 10 years later. And then more recently with Rometty, she's continued on the same path where she changed the 401k contributions to where you get nothing if you leave the company before, the mid-December of the year.
In the last minute, could those things have been avoided, or are they just so inevitable now with the focus, pressure on performance. I mean, could IBM have done any different?
Oh, a CEO has the opportunity to drive their own, if nobody else, has the ability to determine the fate of a corporation. I know there's a quarterly drive for earnings, but once again, we need chief executive officers that stand up again and talk about productivity and driving higher sales and profit productivity, not taking a short-term path. Does that make sense, Jim?
Very good, Peter. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Coming next, we'll look at a little bit more detail how IBM has changed. And we're back with former IBMer Peter Greulich. We're going to look at how these changes have evolved over time and through the prism of 9 CEOs they've had. Now, obviously, Tom Watson Sr. and Jr. Are the foundation of the company, and I might say right off the bat, Watson Sr.'s stock return was 17% versus the average of the market at 11%, and Jr. was 21% versus 9%. 21% is exactly what Buffett has done. Tell us what they did to set the foundation.
I think it's a fascinating story in the what I call the Watson era, father and son. And I think this is probably the first time anybody's ever really looked at both of them and asked what's been consistent between father and son and what hasn't been. Mm-hmm. And the consistency between both of them was the belief system. Watson Sr. said, hey, go out there and spend a lot of time with your customers, make them happy, go the last mile to do the right thing, and, oh, by the way, give full consideration to the individual employee. Watson Jr. picked that up and maintained that consistency of belief system, and this really strengthened IBM, and he brought it down to 3 words: respect, service, and excellent. What he changed that fundamentally just enabled IBM to just take off, and Jim, probably some of the numbers here would have your audience, or your listeners, would wake them up. At the end of 1955, IBM had 56,000 employees, and that was after 4 decades. Watson Jr. added 56,000 employees every 4 years. Yeah. At the end of 4 decades, revenues were $700 million. Watson Jr. added $700 million every 1.5 years. At the end of 4 decades, profit was $73 million. Watson Jr. added $73 million in profit almost every year. And the way he did that is he took the company from what I call an entrepreneurial, monarchical society to a constitution where he decentralized, similar to what Alfred Sloan did with General Motors in the 1920s.
And I might say over this time, IBM wiped out GE, Honeywell, DEC, RCA, Sun Micro, and a whole bunch of others. We're going to move to Vin Leerhsen now because he contrasts well with the current paper buying stock back. He bet the entire company on the System 360. Tell us about that.
Tom Watson Jr., when he took over in 1956, saw a shift coming with computers, and he pulled Vin Leerhsen in as his kind of his touchstone, the loudmouth touchstone. It was, I think one person described him as a porcupine with quills that would prick you as you walked by. And he decided that he's going after the mainframe, and he's going to, between he and Tom Watson Jr., they're going to invest. IBM invested $5 billion, which was 1 to 2.5 times what IBM spent, or what the U.S. government spent building the atomic bomb, to actually get ahead of the competition, as you pointed out, and they were very successful. I mean, it's still driving the lion's share of IBM's profits today.
I think in constant dollars that investment would be $137 billion now, which is slightly less than the stock buyback. Now, Frank Carey and John Opel were there when I were there, and you talk about them making some fundamental mistakes. And, of course, my favorite is that John Opel missed his revenue plan, now going on 30 years. He still hasn't made what he was supposed to make it. But talk briefly about them, the failure of FS, et cetera.
I've gotten feedback even since I published my book, and IBMers have been reading it. And I think Frank Carey was probably one of the greatest chief executive officers that IBM had. You have to consider the decade that he had when there was economic stagflation. Yep. He had the lawsuits, The way I write about it in my book is that it was the decade of 3 Category 5 storms: economic, political, and competitive. There was a project called the Future Systems Project to replace the System 360 and make that kind of an investment again. And the head of that was John Opel, and he failed. And underneath a Watson Jr. or Watson Sr. era, if you failed an executive like that, the way they stopped the Peter Principle was they moved you aside. You didn't lose your employment, but you lost your job. And Opel, again, as he became CEO, as you said, set an expectation that we'll have a $100 billion IBM by 1990. Most IBMers remember that, but he actually even said $180 billion IBM by 1994.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that number before.
Yep.
And for the record, I think IBM's at, $81 billion right now in 2017?
Yeah, they hit $107 billion, I think, in 2011, and it's been going downhill ever since.
And we'll say before we move on, Opel also made a fundamental one-time fire sale by, we won't get too complex, but by basically taking rental inventory and giving it a one-time sales price. That also was a long-term negative. Now, John Akers, he's considered the only IBM CEO to have failed.
You know, that's why in my book I really took a hard look at it. If I had just looked at the CEOs standalone, I don't think it would have had as much meaning. I tied him into an era that I call the arrogant, chief executive officers. It was a time that he was set up for failure, as far as I'm concerned, by John Opel.
Interesting.
Opel set an expectation, as we just talked about, and then Akers' mistake was not reversing direction fast enough. I mean, you want to feel sorry for him, but he was on the board of directors. He knew what was going on. And when he took over, he should have said, look, these are numbers we can't make, and we've got to reverse what we're doing and get our heads back.
And then he blamed the employees, right?
That's right. He made 2 classic mistakes, as far as I'm concerned. One, it's not my fault. It's the employee's fault. And number 2, he listened to Wall Street and said, hey, I'm going to break this company up into, baby blues. And within 1 year, 1 out of every 3 shareholders sold their stock. And it dropped by 33% in 1 year.
And that leads to the next guy, because Lou Gerstner was brought in from the outside. The first thing he did was not decide to break up IBM. But when I read this, I got kind of a tale of 2 cities with Lou. Big success and then not understanding the culture. I
refer to him as the Shakespearean king. Right? He came in and he had the concept right. He got his messages right. He talked about one IBM. He talked about putting the customer first. He talked about breaking down internal bureaucracy. He talked about taking the battle of the competition. And the way I put that in my book is, number 1, it woke up the IBM culture that had gone to sleep. We all had just kind of listened to Akers, and it was kind of like putting us to sleep. And then finally, we all knew it was time for change, and Lou Gerstner came in and said, let's go do it. What he fails to point out in his book is during that time frame, number 1, the culture supported him. I mean, we went after it. And then the second thing he really fails to point out, and probably even we should acknowledge this in our culture, is that the U.S. economy hit the Great Expansion. It is the longest expansion in the U.S. economy, started in March of 1991 and went through March of 2001, which is a pretty good parallel for Lou Gerstner's time at IBM. And I think you ought to acknowledge that.
Let me ask you this, Pete, because you say this in the book. What does it exactly mean? The respect for the individual is obviously the Watson's number 1 value belief. And he said respect for individual had become the most corrupted IBM belief. What did he mean by that?
Well, I can only, you'd have to ask him. Maybe you can get him on the show. But I think, being an employee... I think being an employee is that he got isolated behind his generals. I've talked to several executives that said that as soon as he felt like he had the right generals in place, he kind of, let the company run and didn't come back and inspect his generals. And I think what they did is they, said, hey, look, these employees down here, they did exactly what Akers did, is they blamed the employees and just said, look, it's this respect stuff that's causing problems, and that wasn't it.
All right, you listen to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll be back in the next segment for the final 2 CEOs and then the human side of the IBM culture crisis. And we're talking to Peter Greulich. He's the author of Think Again, IBM Can Maximize Shareholder Value. And to get back to the final 2 CEOs, and Sam Palmisano and then Ginni Rometty. And Sam's was considered a very successful tenure, and Ginni so far has been a kind of a disaster. But they're really both related to the roadmap. Tell us what the roadmap is and how destructive it's ended up being.
Yeah, Jim, it has been probably the number one, iconic failure that I would attribute to Sam Palmisano. He established 2 5-year roadmaps, and the goal was to drive earnings per share. And to give you an example of the effect it had on IBM employees is that they effectively, whenever they'd hear about the roadmap, is say, we're just roadkill on these roadmaps. And what it basically did is we will do anything to drive profit. He wasn't worried about profit productivity, because that's been falling since 1999, as well as sales productivity. He was concerned about driving the bottom line. And there's a lot of ways to drive profit productivity or drive what appears to be profit productivity through financial engineering, and that's transferring wealth within the corporation. And that can be, changing benefit packages under Sam Palmisano, where he actually, as we talked before, in the UK, eliminated their defined benefit plan. And Ginni Rometty, who has taken action similar to that by changing the 401k plan, the separation plans that IBM has had, and they're no longer industry leading, but basically just meets minimums for employees, if that.
Now, you talk about Gerstner coming in when there was a cash crisis and really going and fixing that. But now you call this a culture crisis. And does that mean that in Ginni's existing CEO right now that she's really going to have a tough deal fixing this stuff because the culture is sort of in whatever you want to call it, trouble, limbo?
Right. One of the things that I've done is I've actually gone back and studying IBM history is that there's actually, in my opinion, been 5 crises, and this is the 6th. The 5 crises were, when Watson Sr. came in 1914 and 15, and at that point there was a culture and a cash crunch, and he went to work and fixed both. In the recession of 1920 and 21, there was a cash crunch, and he took actions that he thought he needed to have, which was lay off people. But actually, from that, what he learned was the power of having a dedicated employee standing in front of a loyal customer with the latest products in hand to sell when a recession ended. And that was kind of what took IBM through all these crises after that, is that they would double down on research and development whenever a recession hit, and they would ensure that they maintained and held on to their best employees and kept those employees out in front of the customers, so that every time a recession, they always end, at least they always have so far, you had a dedicated employee in front of a loyal customer, and you had the best products, and when that recession ended, boom, you were gone. The difference today is that when we had the recession in the early 2000s, IBM was investing in stock. Mm-hmm. They weren't investing in artificial intelligence. They weren't investing in the cloud. They weren't listening to their customers. They were having resource actions that was impacting sales and profit productivity, and therefore you didn't have loyal, dedicated employees. You didn't have loyal customers because they didn't know who to call anymore, and no longer did you have, the best leading-edge products. IBM should have been out there leading cloud, not Amazon. They should be leading artificial intelligence, not, be competing tooth and nail with Amazon, Google's, Facebook, and all these other people that are investing. And sorry, long answer to get to the point that Rometty's going to have if she stays in, she's going to have a tough time reversing this downward trend because it isn't a cash problem, it's a cultural problem. Does that make sense, Jim?
Yeah, it's a great insight. Now, I want to get down to the human level so that people can really get inside the suffering that's been going on. For one thing, resource actions have been going on since Gerstner, which would make this almost 30 years of resource. You talk about human relations has become human resources. Start off saying how was employee morale destroyed, and how did the employees become so disengaged?
I think what resource actions do in their very core is they convince every employee within IBM that performance doesn't matter. The resource actions are indiscriminate. It doesn't matter how profitable your individual division is. It doesn't matter how productive your individual unit is. You know that when resource actions hit, that you're going to give up your percentage of people, and it doesn't matter, what your previous rank was, how you were evaluated. And what it does is it basically convinces employees that productivity doesn't matter. And that's the reason, Jim, that I really focus on sales productivity and profit productivity, because when you send those messages to your employees, they're not disgruntled. They may be disillusioned, but when you send those kind of messages with a human resources policy, it's got to show up in your productivity. And then all you've got left is financial engineering to keep your profits up.
Tell people what a typical RA day, a resource action day, is like. Just the level of stress, and you talk about it. People calling each other and the whisper numbers and the whole deal. Talk about it.
Yeah, I describe one in my book, as you have talked about. I also took that incident and put it up on LinkedIn to kind of just let your listeners know. It's had over 70,000 reads.
Wow.
And it is a very emotional time. Generally, employees know it's coming. I mean, there's no way it's kept quiet. People talk about it. And in the incident I share, I was with the company in 2009, and I was in the most profitable division that IBM had, software group. And we had the whisper number, 17,000 people are going to be gone within 24 hours. People's performance appraisals have been dropped within the last, 60 to 90 days, and everybody pretty much assumed that if your performance appraisal was dropped, that you were on the list. And it started bright and early. I've had stories where people were called on vacation with their kids in their rooms in Paris, woke up from a dead sleep to be told they've been resourced. One story I'll share, Jim, if we have time, it's just a heart-wrenching story, is that one manager just didn't tell his employee because he needed that employee to perform at an event in front of some other IBMers. He was afraid that he wouldn't go. One of my friends who was a manager walked in and commented to the young man before he went on stage to talk to the IBMers, saying how professional he was to having been just resourced and still show up to do that presentation. And he found out, 5 minutes before doing that presentation that he had been resourced. He collected himself. I almost get in tears thinking about it. Collected himself, went out and did his presentation, and caught the next flight home. You can't do these kind of things to employees and not expect that those that are left over have a bad taste in their mouth. And what
I have trouble with, and it's kind of an indictment of senior manager, is, sometimes these things have to happen in the real world now, but this has been going on without stop for 30 years, although IBM now covers up when they're doing it. And the other interesting thing is, and you can talk about why that has been so incessant. The other thing is, IBM now has more employees in India, 130,000, than in the U.S.
Yeah, well, basically what they've been doing is what they did, with similar to the lease rental program sell-off, is they've been exchanging what I call a very highly motivated, highly productive, and therefore highly paid employee for lower-paid employees that then have lower motivation and lower productivity. It's taking, I think one of the statistics that, if I can find it here, is the impact of sales productivity on IBM's numbers, and hopefully we have time here. If IBM produced we talked about it, $79.9 billion at the end of 2016. If they had just had and maintained productivity similar to 1999, their head count of 414,000 that they had in 2016 should have produced not 79.9, but 147 billion in revenue. 147 billion instead of 79.9. A different way of looking at that from almost a negative perspective is that 79.9 billion if they'd maintained the productivity, could have been delivered by almost 200,000 fewer employees. And those are staggering numbers, Jim.
Wow. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship stations, WGCH, Greenwich, and Yale Radio, WYBC. In our final national segment, we'll look at fixing IBM. Our guest author, Peter Greulich, expert on IBM, and as we talked about at the beginning, you think moving towards stakeholder value away from the financial engineering is key. First question, should Ginni Rometty be fired?
She's not mine to fire, I'm afraid. I think she needs to be replaced. She's had the time in office. She's been in as long as John Akers. She says she's reversed the roadmaps, but hasn't. The same, processes are in place. She doesn't understand human motivation,
which is my
what made IBM successful.
Second question, then, what are the attributes the new CEO has to have?
That's a great question. One of the reviews I got on my book is when they read about the attributes, I've come to call this the Jimmy Stewart CEO test because it sounds like I'm describing Jimmy Stewart. But there's 4 tests that I apply. One is I call it the desire and ability test. Does the CEO have the desire to distribute profits equitably? If you look at Watson Sr., he actually took cuts in pay so that he could pay his employees properly. And do they display the ability to adapt as necessary? And that would be the failure of Lou Gerstner. In 1999, he failed to adapt and understand what was going on. And then there's the know thyself test. Do you, as a CEO, have do you understand what your strong mental aptitudes are and your weaknesses? And do you understand how to play those strengths and weaknesses within a corporate society to get your job done? The other one is know others test, and that's Frank Carey. He carried that company through the 70s because he understood his people. He was passionate to his people. He said he stayed awake at night worrying about getting things done. Yes, he made mistakes, but I think they were very human mistakes. And the last one I call the Vulcan mind meld test. You can see Spock walking up and putting his hands on somebody's face and saying, you need to understand what I want to get done, and I need to understand you. But it's more like, as Watson Jr. said, you need to have all these ways of communicating with your employees. In the 20th century, it's called management by wandering around, right? Talking to people, communicating with them. And you need a variety of ways to get your feedback as a CEO. And do you have a CEO that does that? And I think, Ginni Rometty just fails on most of these tests.
Now, Warren Buffett always says that, you need a moat, a competitive moat for long-term value creation. Do you think IBM's moat is its culture, and can it get it back?
What a great question, Jim, because I've been thinking about that since I've been writing this book. I believe IBM has great castle walls. I believe it has great moats, to use Warren Buffett's analogy. I think what Warren Buffett forgot is that, if you have a moat around a castle, it's just a pleasant watercourse if you don't have enthusiastic, engaged, and passionate defenders. And what Watson Sr. did was he put up on those battlements, which is the place where the knights would walk on those castles. You got to have somebody shooting arrows and throwing rocks and pouring hot oil down. And I think if you remember back to the 20th century, there was a phrase that identified IBM, and it was, you won't lose your job. Nobody lost their job buying IBM. And that was a statement of belief in those people, that passion of the employees to do what was right by the customer. So I'd go back to Warren Buffett and say, hey, Warren, you need to not only talk about high walls and moats, but you need to talk about passionate, engaged, and enthusiastic defenders.
All right, now you're calling for returning to business first rather than paper financial engineering first, investing in people. What do you mean by the knowledge industry production floor, this reform vision you have there?
Well, if you look at my book cover, we actually defined that book cover on what I consider a knowledge industry production floor, and it was a company called 99 Designs. We'd hit a brick wall on creativity. We went and looked at, asked IBMers what it should look like, and we just kept hitting brick walls. And we went to 99 Designs, which basically breaks down international borders. And that cover was designed by a young man in the Philippines. I hung on to my local group because in Austin, Texas, and they did the final touches on it. But we needed to break a boundary. And this knowledge industry production floor is where you start bringing together the true top people from around the world. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're in the Philippines or Malaysia, and you figure out how to reward them and bring forward the best products and the best intuition and the best inventive ideas. And those are forming today, and I think, you know, the new millennial generation will understand what I'm talking about, right? It's this social media somehow being used in a new way to get the best and the brightest to contribute to your project.
Interesting.
Does that make sense, Jim?
Why did work at home fail?
I have once again another LinkedIn that's gotten up, I think, to about 20,000 hits. But it was seen as a benefit, right? Fundamentally, if you don't invest in work at home as a productivity tool and track productivity and really prove that employees are more productive at home, which I believe they are, then corporate starts to think of it as a benefit. And if they think it's just a benefit that you give an employee and doesn't have a true productivity impact, you can start doing things like co-location and say, hey, all you employees, why don't you come back into the office? And you're not making a good business decision at that point, right? You're making a decision based on no data, which is really strange to do for a company that's, you know, heading down the path to artificial intelligence.
So you think that they basically shot a productive way of organizing themselves. How do they return to relationship-driven sales? I mean, you talk about the sales productivity being so down.
Right. Well, I mean, in the past, and this is, you know, an area where you'd have to have a CEO go out and say, we're going to get back to having relationships with our customers. You know, what you have to do is develop products that inspire integrity in your sales force. When I sold for IBM, I really rarely sold a product. We'd talk about speeds and feeds, but I would spend half my time talking about IBM and how IBM wouldn't let them fail and how IBM had the depth of support and the knowledge to make things happen. And you need a sales force that just believes that in their core. And I talk about a few companies in the past in my book, Royal Typewriter, George Ed Smith, and he talked about, you know, how a salesman, when they're looking at a company, should say, you know, it's 25% on me and it's 75% on if you've got the right products that meet customers and have true value in the customer's eyes. Does that make sense?
Been a fascinating interview, a lot of insights here, and you finished the book up, IBM's Future Lies in Uniting Its Stakeholder Community. I want to thank Peter Greulich. The book is, Think Again, IBM Can Maximize Shareholder Value. And for that book right now, you can buy the print edition on Amazon and get the Kindle version for $2.99 rather than the usual $9.99, and give the Kindle away for Christmas or give the paper version away. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You can get our podcast on iTunes at the network, biztalkradio.com. Our YouTube versions, you can search Biz Talk with Jim Campbell or Park City Productions 06604. Thanks to Peter Greulich. Thanks to our national audience for listening. See everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.